Attention engines 4, 1, 2, 3, ladder 1, battalion 1. Respond to the station on Cohasset Avenue for report of a fire. Engines 4, 1, 2, 3, ladder 1, battalion 1. Respond to the station on Cohasset Avenue for report of a fire. Police are on scene reporting this fire at this time, 2310.
Nightclub inferno, scores dead as show goes tragically wrong.
They were jumping out the windows and out the front door. There were people on fire.
Evening, a massive fire at an American nightclub packed with young music fans has left at least 85 people dead. The blaze started during a rock concert when stage fireworks used as part of the act set the ceiling on fire. It took just minutes for the flames to rip through the building, leaving the people inside little time to escape.
In depth tonight, finger pointing, but no clear answers in the investigation into that deadly nightclub fire in West Warwick, Rhode Island. There is a vigil scheduled to get underway to remember the 97 people who lost their lives, the second memorial of the day. But amid the memorials and grief, investigators are asking hard questions. They claim they're not getting the answers they need to pinpoint exactly who or what was to blame.
From the haunted heartland in Omaha, Nebraska, my name is Brian Corey, and I welcome you one and all to this episode of the Necronomicast. 18 years ago this week, one of the deadliest fires in American history took place at the Station Nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island, when the band Great White's Pyrotechnics ignited the nightclub, killing 100 people and devastating the lives of hundreds more. My guest tonight is best-selling author and 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist Scott James, whose new book, Trial by Fire, investigates all the central figures with first-hand accounts, interviews, and court documents. Scott explores the rush to judgment about what happened that left the victims, their families, and a community desperate for justice. Trial by Fire, a devastating tragedy, 100 lives lost, and a 15-year search for truth, with my guest, Scott James. And now joining us for a late night conversation in San Francisco, California, we have the author of Trial by Fire, Scott James.
Well, thank you for having me. That's great.
I'm really excited to have you a part of the show. When we were talking off the air, I was letting you know a little bit of my past of being a musician, and your book really made me revisit a lot of my feelings that I had back in 2003 and after the Station Nightclub fire. So having you as part of the program, it's really a treat, and I'm really so appreciative of you taking the time to speak with me and my listeners today.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. And, I think some of the issues that I look at in the book, even though this was a terrible tragedy so many years ago, I think are still with us today. I think the tragedy at the ghost ship warehouse, not too far from me here in Oakland, California, shows that these are still clear and present dangers across this country.
So before we go back to the Station Nightclub fire of 2003, you're from Rhode Island. You're in San Francisco now, working and living, but you're from the area. So you're a local boy kind of covering this story. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your experiences growing up in Rhode Island and what.
Yeah, I grew up in a suburb of Providence. Rhode Island, as many people probably know, is the smallest state in the United States. So everything's kind of a suburb of Providence, Rhode Island. It's like a city state. And this really is the worst thing that happened where I grew up. And I worked in news there and journalism for a long time, but I was actually gone. I'd moved to California by the time this fire happened. I'd been gone for several years. And this would actually turn out, I'll explain as we go along, why that was kind of key for my ability to write this book and for people to speak with me. There was a lot of coverage, obviously, at the time this happened. It was the deadliest rock concert in the United States history, still is. It's the deadliest single building fire since we've had modern fire codes. And that remains to be the case. 100 people died on February 20th, 2003, when the rock band Great White lit off fireworks as part of its show. The fireworks ignited some foam that was on the walls of the club, which was sound foam. It should have been fireproof. It wasn't. It was packing foam, and packing foam is basically equivalent of solid gasoline. So in a matter of seconds, the place went up like a torch. And anyone who was in that building 90 seconds after that fire started was basically left for dead or died.
Unbelievable. Yeah. I in 2003, I remember seeing it coming across the screen, watching the news, and being a musician. I've played in beautiful concert halls with classical music. I've also played in dingy dives with rock bands and jazz groups. And I've been to shows in beautiful halls, and I've been in shows that are in places much like the station. I don't want to call them death traps, but places where after this tragedy, I really had to take some stock of like what building I'm going into to see a show, because these people were just going. They thought it was just a great night out to see a band, have a good time, have some beers. And like you said, within 90 seconds of them shooting off those gerbs, pandemonium, all hell broke loose. And
this is in this particular case, this is like they call it the perfect storm of fires, because so many things went wrong simultaneously. And had just one of those things not been wrong, everyone would have lived. And so it's a terrible combination of events. But one of the really awful twists of this story, and why it became, in part why it became so famous and infamous, is because it was also all caught on video from the inside. So it just happened that a local TV news crew was doing a story, coincidentally, and they were recording, the camera was rolling when the band took the stage and lit off its fireworks. So everything is meticulously documented. And unfortunately, that videotape went viral. We didn't call things in 2003 going viral, but think of this, in 2003, the iPhone had not been invented yet. So it was extremely rare for tragedies of this magnitude to be caught on tape. And for it to happen that it was a professional television journalist who caught it on tape, and that's extremely rare. You've got like the Hindenburg and 9/11, where tragedies of this scope have been actually captured by professional journalists who just happened to be there. Ironically, the story that the local TV news guy was working on was about public venue safety. So there's this terrible, ironic twist as well. So that video went out on CNN and all the cable news networks, and it was seen all over the world. I talked to people who heard about the fire when they were on a remote island in Greece and saw it. For me, I was from the area, but I had long since moved to California, and I was sitting in my apartment in San Francisco and watched the tragedy unfold like a lot of people did. But I had a somewhat of a personal connection to it. I had actually been in that club. I had been to a show. I knew that place. I remember when I'd been there, I immediately recognized it as an old Papa Brillo's Italian restaurant. It had been converted from being one of these chain restaurants into being a rock and roll club. It just had that particular look that those places did. And it was, it was fun. I mean, of course, it was, a little threadbare and smelled like spilled beer and old cigarettes. People could still smoke in clubs back then. Yeah. But people were there to have fun. It's infamous now because of the tragedy that happened and all the lives that were lost and then people that were hurt. But people need to remember the reason people were there was they were rock and rollers. They were there to have a good time, lots of tattoos, lots of drinking. A lot of people maybe smoking some weed in the parking lot. People were there to have fun, and it just took a terrible, horrible twist.
Yeah, totally. Sounds like the kind of place I would visit back circa 2002, 2003 and play in. And I've been in those situations where, I'm a trumpet player. So I played with horn bands and funk bands and ska bands and jazz and in those kind of clubs. But you kind of walk in and you look around and you're like, yeah, it's kind of dingy, but wait till the lights go down and then they turn up the stage lights and then the people kind of file in and then it generates some excitement and everything. But I've been in those places and I've thought back with my reasoned adult perspective after reading this book and just through life and just how sketchy some kind of places are in terms of, well, there's an exit here and there's an exit over there, but we're still going to cram 400 or 500 people into this place. I've only been to one show, and you kind of mentioned it in your book with a band that shot off pyrotechnics. There was a KISS tribute band.
Yes, yeah.
And this Kiss tribute band performed in my college town, Lincoln, Nebraska. And me and my friend Zip went to go see them. And they shot off these gerbs, these fireworks, these indoor pyrotechnics in this club back in 1996 or 7. And even back then I was like, ooh, they're shooting off fireworks in the hurricane. Oh, how's this? This doesn't.
Well, even on the best of circumstances, even if the building itself hadn't had this dangerous foam on the walls, the fact was that we're shooting off 15-foot fireworks in a place with a 12-foot ceiling. So it was already kind of a recipe for a disaster to possibly happen. One of the things that they're supposed to do, because this is documented in the book, and it really had not been reported previously, because certain things have come to light in the years that have passed that were not readily available to the news media at the time that this tragedy happened. People went to court to make sure that documents that were previously secret, like testimony before grand juries, were actually made public, but many years after all of the legal drama had played out. So we learn through these documents that had not been seen before that there's a checklist that people are told when they buy these things right at the point of purchase. These gerbs, they're said, "Oh, if you're going to use these, dude, here's what you got to do. There's 10 things you got to make sure happen in order to use these safely." Among them are that you should do a test, like hours before people are at the venue while it's empty. Do a test of your whole system to see if these fireworks are shooting in a direction that might be dangerous to the audience or to flammable objects. They also say that you should have the stage flanked with your own people with fire extinguishers in their hands, so that should something go wrong, it can be immediately snuffed out. None of those things happened in this case, and that led to tragedy. I mean, again, all the things that went wrong, it was illegal in Rhode Island to shoot off these fireworks. It was illegal to bring them into the state. But even if he had just simply broken the law and done it, but had followed his checklist that he had been told in writing repeatedly to follow, then no one would be dead. The building didn't have sprinklers. It didn't require them. So this is what we call grandfathering in. And this happens all over the United States, where older buildings are like, well, the code for when that building was built is this, and so therefore they have to follow that building code, and they don't have to have a modern building code. But I have to say, sprinklers are a technology that dates back to the 1800s. So why public venues where people are allowed to gather don't have sprinklers is amazing to me. And what's interesting is that, when the criminal aftermath and the investigation of this case, they went after the nightclub business operators were the target of the prosecution and the investigation. But it seems to be lost on people that they didn't actually own the building. They were renters. They rented that place. They didn't own it. So it is interesting that people have to think that it's the responsibility of the renter to install sprinklers in the property they're renting, and that's not really how the real world works. And in these cases, and the same thing happened with the ghost ship fire out here in California and Oakland. The building owners are never held responsible for the fact that their buildings are literal death traps.
Yeah, and when you said earlier it was like a perfect storm for this fire to take place, I mean, we have unauthorized, illegal, in the state of Rhode Island, fireworks being shot off in this building. You have foam that the renters purchased. And was some of the foam installed before they ever started renting it when it was?
Yeah, there were 2 layers of foam. Some foam was put in many years before these guys rented the place by previous club operators. And then they put in another layer on top of that. This is all about sound abatement.
Sure.
One of the things that was a problem with this particular club, remember I said it was an old Italian restaurant. It wasn't really built to be a rock and roll venue. And so the neighbors, understandably, complained about noise coming from the place. And one of the neighbors happened to be a guy who worked at a foam sales place. And so he met the owners of the club. The owners club, he had filed many complaints about the noise. So the new owners of the business, first day, just when they bought it, went over to say, hey, what can we do to fix this situation? And he had a lot of suggestions. And one of them was, well, I work for this foam company and we sell foam that's used for sound abatement. And that's eventually where they went. And that was a tragic decision because even though the book documents really for the first time that the nightclub operators ordered sound foam, which by law is supposed to be fireproof, fire retardant. What they were delivered instead was something very different and something very deadly. They estimated that the amount of foam on the walls was the equivalent of 13 gallons of gasoline. So think about that. Throw a match on 13 gallons of gasoline, and it is going to happen instantly. You're going to have an inferno, and that's exactly what happened in this nightclub.
Yeah, you technically have a full gas tank for a medium-sized car. Like I said, these illegal fireworks, no sprinklers, nobody standing by with fire extinguishers as prescribed on this checklist, doors that were insufficient for the crowd in terms of people getting out safely that fast. I was reading that at one point the fire marshal even took down some exit signs because they didn't want people going through the kitchen to get out. So all these things at once at this club where everybody's just going to go and have a good time with this band, Jack Russell's Great White. Your book is really I have to hand it to you because, and I could tell that you wrote this from the standpoint of being a local guy originally, and you know a lot of the players involved. You worked as in journalism as a supervisor of a boss of the club owners when they worked for the station.
It's not just I never knew one of the club owners, Michael Dedarian. I never had met him, but his brother Jeffrey Dedarian had worked for me as a TV news reporter at a local TV station in Providence. This goes back 25 years. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that so did the photographer who shot that video. He happened to have been someone who had worked for me early in his career. And the probably one of the greatest enemies of the Dedarian brothers, a lawyer for the other defendant in the case who pointed the fingers at the Dedarian brothers, the tour manager who set off the fireworks, Daniel Beakley, his lawyer, a guy named Tom Bridey, also worked for me as a TV news reporter way back when. So I got to hear it from all the different sides. But what's interesting about these connections is I had this expectation that because I had known these people, albeit many, many years ago, that when I decided I was going to take on this project, that they would just welcome me with open arms and tell me their story because they kind of knew me. But in fact, I found that people were very hesitant to talk. And in some cases, it literally took years of convincing people to trust you. The nightclub owners, business owners, had not spoken to a journalist since 2 months to the day after the fire, when a local newspaper did kind of a very inflammatory front page article in which it described them as having a quote unquote legacy of death. So this was one of these big Sunday 6-column headline investigations that basically tied together the fact that the brothers were of Armenian heritage, which means that their family had fled a genocide during the First World War, to the fact that their mother died when they were children, to the nightclub, and kind of painted this really weird idea that these people had a legacy of death, like they were the angels of death. And so when they saw this headline, they thought, well, we are never going to get a fair shake from the news media. And even though Jeffrey had worked as a TV news reporter and he was a journalist, they pledged that day never to speak to another journalist. But I didn't know that. And so here I come many years later thinking that there were unanswered questions about this case, and I'm going to try to get some answers, and thinking I would get full cooperation. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. They did not want to talk, and it took a lot of convincing and a lot of trust building over the course of years to get them to share their version of events.
You know, that really comes across from cover to cover in your book. I have to hand it to you because it's different than any historical book that I've read or a true crime book that I've read, because you handle it deftly with an uncommon touch. When you start talking about the situation of the night, you don't shy away from it because you can't, because you have to be real with what happened to really begin to appreciate or understand the tragedy that happened. And so it's very hard to read the very first third of the book because you're talking about people suffering and dying in horrible conditions that happened just so fast. Then so that's like a third of the book. And then the next third of the book, there's a lot of the investigation. And I found it very interesting reading about like Rhode Island politics and how that was involved. I mean, you had a quote in there that in Rhode Island, on a slow day, you can do a corruption story.
That is true. I have to say, we would sometimes, back when I was running the local newsroom there, sometimes it was just your imagination. You would say to yourself, let's do something about stop signs. Well, what about stop signs? Well, there's got to be corruption there because this is Rhode Island. And so sure enough, we'd send out a reporter and they'd say, guess what? The mayor's brother-in-law has the exclusive contract for stop signs. And he's charging 4 times as much for a stop sign in that town than they charge in Omaha, Nebraska. So that's a story. Yeah. So really, oftentimes you just said, well, I've got to think of it. And surely it will be there. Probably one of our, we did several stories that got a lot of attention. One was an investigation of a local mayor named Buddy Cianci, who was quite a colorful character. He ended up going to federal prison over time because of his corruption. But there was one time a local official, so the head of the lottery, he was quite a flamboyant character, and he loved spending taxpayers' money on things like big cars and expensive items, all billed to the taxpayer. And I think he said at a press conference or something, when people asked him about this, what seemed to be obvious graft, he said, you just try to catch me. Just try to catch me. Well, we decided we would take him up on that offer. And so we sent in a pair of producers undercover to follow him as he went to a government conference in Las Vegas. And let's just say there wasn't a lot of government work done at this conference in Las Vegas.
You don't say. Really? Is that right?
And he was charging like champagne to the room and things like that. And he never went to a single part of the conference. We had documented it on the golf course the entire time. And when we aired that story, the name of it was Viva Las Vegas. And he lost his job. And it was quite extraordinary in that state that he was held accountable. And there are moments like that where it takes, unfortunately, the news media or journalists or some outside group, most likely from the Fourth Estate, to hold the corrupt officials accountable. The Providence Journal, which, as you know, I look at very critically the coverage that they did when it came to covering this fire, but hats off to them. Their journalism has brought down at least 2 state Supreme Court justices for corruption of some sort or ties to the mafia, problems like that. So that's the type of work that journalists have to do in that state.
So that was the whole context of this, not only this horrible tragedy of the fire, but the local government, the government officials, everything just kind of let the whole community down. But then the last third of the book, you talk about the aftermath and how people healed and how the community began to heal and come together. And it took a long time for people to really to heal. I don't know. I shouldn't say that they're completely healed now. That's not true. But it took a long time for people who lost people in the fire, and then people who were just injured in the fire. You had scores of people injured in the fire. And then there was kind of a weird, when it came to dispersing like insurance money and settlements and things like that, there was people who thought if you lost somebody, that's different than if you were injured yourself instead of just losing your life. So, I mean, your whole book just goes through just the whole story in such a thoughtful manner. And then the inspirational stories at the end, how people healed,
right,
and just brought their lives together after this.
Yeah, I mean, out of all of this tragedy are unbelievably inspiring stories, which are also in the book. I mean, people, it's interesting, people cry not when they're reading the horror, they cry when they read the people overcoming what they went through. That's what really moves you emotionally. I get emotional even just thinking about it. Some of these people, like I think of Phil Barr, the swimmer from Bates College. He was a competitive NCAA swimmer, and he is horribly burned, left for dead inside this inferno, and does get out, almost dies trying to recover from his injuries. And then he goes on, I won't ruin it for people, but he goes on to become kind of like a star of the NCAA in a very unusual way. Quite a story. So there are those stories as well. You think of another person, Gina Russo, who, again, was horribly burned, left for dead in this inferno. Not even clear who dragged her out of it. But she was given last rites, and she was a goner. She was one of the worst burned people at this tragedy. And then she goes on to do unbelievable things. She ends up helping all sorts of people. She tries to create healing for that community. One of the things I explore in the book, which completely blew my mind when I found out about it, was how much the various types of victims of the fire hate each other. That is such a twist I did not expect, and I'll explain it a little bit. So there are the families of the people who perished, and they look at the people who survived as somehow accomplices in their own loved ones' deaths.
Right.
And in their minds, it's like, you're alive because you stepped on my little brother, sister, husband on your way out the door. They are dead because you survived. Now, none of that might be true, and they certainly know nothing like that was the case. And in fact, when we analyze how people perish in this fire, that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't matter. It's become this belief. And so you have this war between the families of the people who perished and those who survived. And straight in the middle of that is this woman, Gina Russo, because she lost her fiance. So she lost a loved one in the fire, and yet she also was a survivor who was horribly burned. And so this woman, who's almost like a saint in some ways, although she would disagree with that, she takes such grief to this day. We're talking about, it's going to be coming up on the 18th anniversary of this tragedy, is on February 20th. To this day, she continues to receive grief from people who like to antagonize her because she is a survivor. It's not enough that she lost her fiance, and people will actually say to her face, well, you weren't married yet, so you really weren't related to this guy. People say horrible things like that to a woman who has done so much to help these people. So one of the challenges of writing this book, and frankly, and now that the book is out and talking about it, is that some of these people are tough to like. I mean, when people do awful things like that, you can say, I understand their rage, their pain, and when people are so angry and so hurt, they say terrible things. But these things make it difficult to rally behind some of these folks because they say outrageous things like that. And so it was one of the challenges in the aftermath of this fire was charities really did not rush to come to the aid of these people. They're rock and rollers. They got tattoos. Some of them got foul mouths. Some of them say ugly things like this publicly about people like Gina Russo. Mm-hmm. And so, no, it's not the same thing as raising money for Alzheimer's research or breast cancer walk or kids with cancer. So these people were largely left to fend for themselves. And that's a whole other part of the story that I explore how that happened. And some of them were terribly exploited. They didn't get settlement money that they should have because they were predatory lenders and people like that who were ready to jump in and take it away from them because they weren't particularly highly educated either. So the story is one that I look at where I say that this is about a kind of a failure of many, many different institutions that we think are going to be there to protect us from something like this happening. Let's have sprinklers, let's have proper inspections. During and after, in the aftermath, they weren't there to help them and with what they needed to be done. So I think ultimately this is a story about how our institutions, we need to take a good look at them and see what they're doing in these circumstances that allowed this to happen. And then in the aftermath, allow these people to suffer and not get the help they needed.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to ask you, and I'm glad you touched on it, was I was going to ask if you thought some of the reaction and the heartache that still is in the community is because, these were blue-collar, working-class, rock and rollers. Like you said, people out on a Friday night, or was it a Saturday? I don't remember, but just going out.
It was a Thursday night.
It was a Thursday night, just going out to see a rock show. Let's have a few beers and let's do it up with Great White. And the institutional failures of the justice system. I mean, people were looking for a pound of flesh after this. They wanted somebody to blame. And the club owners, the renters, they really, in my opinion, and there's a lot of evidence of this in the book, they got thrown under the bus a lot.
Well, I think that the simplistic idea that this was just a few dudes and that's all it was is incorrect. Mm-hmm. These are massive systemic failures that led to this. But the government does not indict itself. And so in a situation like this, they're going to look for a way to look for a scapegoat. Now, I'm not saying that none of these people bear any responsibility. And frankly, they would never say that to you. I mean, when I talk to the brothers after all these years, there's a tremendous amount of guilt. Yeah. There's a tremendous feeling of responsibility. This was their place, so they have that. But whether that's the same thing as that they are somehow just a couple of dudes are completely responsible for this awful tragedy, I think that's a real stretch. And unfortunately, because that's the way that the justice system treated it, I don't think we got really the type of attention and reform that we should have had. The fact is that in the aftermath of this fire, there were very similar fires that happened in the United States and around the world, almost some of them identical, rock bands setting off fireworks and foam ignites, where other people were killed. The Ghost Ship fire out here in Oakland, though different, also a public venue where people were gathered to party. It had no sprinklers. It had not been properly inspected, and 36 people are dead there. So I think that there are larger questions here that didn't necessarily get addressed the way they should, because in Rhode Island, this became a story about, hey, it's just these dudes. That's all we're going to go after criminally to hold responsible.
I mean, even I was reading in your book, and listeners, I know Scott and I are talking a lot about his book, but there's no way in an hour that we can cover even a tenth of the information that's in this book. It's such a fascinating read, not only just about the fire itself and that night, but just the whole aftermath and everything. And reading about like the fire inspector. Well, one could say that the fire inspector really didn't do much inspecting. No tests of the foam that was installed for sound abatement. No tests of that, even though the paperwork they clearly asked for in emails, they clearly asked for sound foam. And I know what sound foam is because I've worked in recording studios and I had one, that room behind me back there. When I built that room back there, listeners can't see it, but what's back there is kind of a music recording area. And when I started putting that together in 2004, I researched very carefully what kind of sound foam to put into my own home. And also I work at a church. What kind of sound foam do we put into our church? So these guys who are trying to do good by the community, when they're renting or they have this club, they purchase what they think is the correct foam to have installed. And yet it's never tested to see if it is 13 gallons of gasoline or if it is the proper flame retardant foam. So the fire inspector doesn't do the correct work there.
And it's indistinguishable. I mean, the foam that is going to go up like a torch looks identical to the foam that is safe. And we explore that in the book a little bit because remember I told the neighbor who had suggested that foam could be a way to abate sound.
Yeah, he worked there.
And he came down after the foam was installed. He went on the stage. He touched it with his hand. He stood, inches away from it. He close enough to smell it. So a person who is an expert in that product sees on the walls of this club after it's been installed that even he, touching, smelling, looking, it was indistinguishable from what would have been safe foam versus what is dangerous foam. And that's, it's funny, people read this and they say, well, why don't they just make one bright red and one's black? They're making different colors. But the fact is all of these things are ordered by color. You can have any color choice you want. Right. Color is not what it distinguishes it. And so the only way to do it is to take a little piece, cut it off, go in the parking lot and try to light it on fire. So I'm part of a writing community here in San Francisco. We have a workspace where we gather, a co-working space for writers. Mm-hmm. And while working on this book about a couple of years ago, we were doing an expansion and I decided I wanted to get some soundproofing into one of the rooms. And so I ordered from Amazon some sound foam. Uh-huh. I was very careful. I made sure that it was the type that was, flame resistant, blah, 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 said right on the thing. There was a big chart that said, this is what you put in Tommy's, the basement with Tommy's drums to, protect your home from excess sound. This sounds perfect. I ordered it. And before the handyman went to install it, I said, hey, do me a favor. Take a piece of that out in the courtyard and try to light it on fire. Nothing, just to use a Bic lighter, nothing,
right.
No big flame, just a simple lighter. And do me a favor, videotape it. Because I've got to cover my butt. I mean, if there's some tragedy that happens at this building down the line, I can say, well, it's not the foam because I bought the right foam and then I tested the foam. And by the way, here's a videotape that shows that it is the correct foam that didn't catch on fire. But guess what? It went up like a torch.
Oh, no.
So I immediately contacted Amazon, which immediately ignored, of course, all of my attempts to contact them. If you ever try to talk to Amazon, you find it quite a daunting thing. So then I posted the video as part of my review, and it is there to this day. So the only reaction from Amazon was to remove from the ad the claim that it was flame resistant.
So they still sell it to this day.
With the picture of the, Johnny's drums in the basement, and this is perfect for sound abatement in your home, and it is highly flammable. So, big business has some responsibility here. That's one of the institutions I think that failed in this case. We don't expect the products we buy. We expect them to be what we said we wanted, and we don't expect to be get a bait and switch and have something dangerous put into our lives, especially if we've made the effort to say we want the non-dangerous version of something. Yeah. So that, I think in this particular case, the brothers would not have known that, looking at a code, a serial code. I'm sure there's different serial codes between what is flame resistant and what is not. But that's not something the average person would know. It actually needs to be spelled out. And it is fascinating that in the aftermath of this, now the receipts that come from that foam company say, if you buy the flammable foam, it's got stamps all over it, like danger, danger, dangerous, take precautions. This is only for shipping. It's not for it's got all those warnings on it that did not exist when it was arrived at the nightclub to be installed on the walls.
I felt really bad for Brian Butler, who was the professional videographer, because he was just in the Station Nightclub shooting what they call B-roll, just some stock footage for this unrelated story to the station about club safety.
Public venue safety.
Venue safety. So, everybody's seen it on the news, different shots, like if they go to a restaurant that it's nondescript, they don't show the logo of the restaurant. They'll just show maybe somebody cutting their steak and make it drink a beer while they talk about maybe restaurant codes or something like that.
Correct.
So this guy was just there on a Thursday night, shooting some video just to put together a different unrelated story to the station, just a news story. And he ends up capturing this horrific yet so important evidence of what this foam, these fireworks, what all this is capable of. And people didn't really treat him very kindly after all this happened.
I think it was fascinating. Here's a person who, he, of course, is a news photographer, and he sees the fire. And so you watch on the video, he is pushed outside with the kind of stampede of people leaving the building. He's literally, you see him in the surge pushed outside, and he immediately does what any news photographer would do. He goes, takes the wide shot, shows that the building's on fire. He has no idea that people are still inside there. And frankly, no one did. People didn't learn about the deaths until much later. Mm-hmm. Now, it all seems very obvious to us in hindsight because we have the command of the facts of what happened. But people did not when things were unfolding. People assumed everybody just got out and that the building was on fire. I mean, you've got people like Phil Barr, fascinating in that he, when the fire starts, this is a swimmer, he goes in his mind, he's like, well, we're going to have to stop this show. And when's it going to restart? So I can, I'm going to be here all night waiting for this show to finish.
Right.
Another woman is like, I'm going to go back in and get my sweater. No, I mean, people did not understand the seriousness of this when it happened. And people made decisions in a split second and a nanosecond that were life and death decisions. And some of them have been damned for the last nearly 20 years because of the decisions they made in a nanosecond. And Brian Butler is one of those people because he thinks, well, okay, now I'm at a news story. And he just keeps rolling and he goes around the building. This tape is invaluable to fire investigators. They study this fire. It's one of the most documented fires in American history. Every fire inspector studies this case. And frankly, a lot of people who just trained to be firefighters see this video and study it because it is so well documented because of the work that Brian Butler did. People actually in the firefighting profession believe that Brian has saved lives because this video has been used for training. But at the time, he was vilified. You had personal injury attorneys who swooped in to try to make money off of this. And in fact, they did. They ended up pocketing $59 million for themselves out of the settlements in this case. And one of their biggest targets was Brian Butler. He worked for this TV station, and now the argument was made that he got in the way of people escaping, that he somehow knowingly blocked exits and people perished as a result of this. There's no evidence that Brian Butler knowingly blocked people from leaving this building or that he's responsible for a single death. There is some evidence or argument that maybe he helped people escape, but it didn't matter. In the zeitgeist of the moment, he was seen as a villain. And even though he was a survivor of this, he was a witness to this, he was involved in this horrible tragedy firsthand, he was kind of treated like the bad guy.
Yeah.
And so when he would go around, this is a really terrible twist, he would go around to cover the story in the aftermath as a journalist, and they'd get to an event related to the fire, and somebody would stop him at the door and say, well, you're allowed in as long as you're not that Brian Butler guy. Of course, nobody knows what a photographer looks like. It's not the same thing as being an anchor or a TV reporter.
Right.
And he would be kind of astonished that there was that much hate towards him for what happened that night. And of course, he didn't like the fireworks. He didn't put the foam on the walls. He had no role in any of this, but somehow he was collateral damage. That was a very tough interview. Brian had never spoken to anyone about what happened that night, not a journalist. And like a lot of people, I don't think that they got the proper medical attention after this, like the counseling that they required. There was so much mental illness that happened after this, in the aftermath of this, with people who just were there. They saw it, they experienced it, they lost 10 friends. The psychological damage was incredible, and yet there was not a system set up to offer these people mental health counseling. So it's tough for Brian, tough interview. It was very emotional, and I think he will. He's not the same person that he was before because of this. No one is. Again,
Throughout the book, you show how debilitating this mental anguish for the survivors and the survivors' guilt is. And I have to compliment you on that. It's a very humane way to write this story. I mean, it would be one way to talk about the fire and talk about the aftermath, but putting the human side on things. One thing when you were talking just now, I was struck when people didn't know how tragic it was at the time. There's a lot of criticism, and Jack Russell deserves a lot of criticism, I think, too. But there's a criticism of him being outside and talking about his tour upcoming, and sure this happened, but the upcoming tour, and people were like, "How there's people dead inside there? How cold and callous?" Well, he didn't know.
He didn't know.
Like
he called his wife when he got outside and said, or he says his old lady, and said, "I think we might lose some of our gear." Yeah. So this is how people understand there's been a fire, but they have no idea that this is so deadly, and what's really going on. It's really interesting. We look at the Brian Butler video today and study it frame by frame, and when you do that, you say to yourself, "How could you not know?" But I think that's not how we experience things in real time. Time is an interesting thing, and people talk about this in the book quite a bit, that how incredibly slowly it moved, like things were moving at 1 second was equal to 1 hour. But at the same time, something like that, your brain is not registering it when it happens. So we look at the Brian Butler tape and we look at it frame by frame, and we see some really terrible images about what is going on there. But these are flashes that happen in a fraction of a second in his viewfinder, which he may or may have not been looking through at that exact second. And so we criticize him with what we see on tape, but I don't know that he saw it, or if he did, I don't know if his brain allowed him to register what he was actually seeing because it was so horrific. Jeffrey Dedarian is an example where I open up the book by explaining that he is, he's covered in blood, but he wasn't hurt. So whose blood is that he has on him at the scene of the fire? This is never answered. Even though at least some in the law enforcement community decided, even that night, without doing any investigation, that Jeffrey was going to take the fall for this because in their mind it was, common sense that if you're the operator of the business or they say the licensee of the establishment, that you're somehow responsible. So even though they're already looking at him as a prime suspect in a crime that we don't even know at that point if it's a crime and anything other than an accident, they don't do the basic things that you do with criminal suspects, which is take the evidence. Right. So the clothing is evidence. So the clothing, we never find out whose blood it was that was on Jeffrey. We do know it's not his own. So in exploring this with him over the years and trying to get him to remember things, there are black spots. There are spots that his mind has either eliminated permanently from his hard drive or just is inaccessible for reasons that, are probably good reasons for the brain not to be thinking about things that he cannot remember. And one of the things is what's that blood? Where did that blood come from? Whose blood is that? Now, I've heard things, but nothing that I could publish in the book that, perhaps he was pulling people out from the building, but I don't know that. I don't have that confirmed.
Yeah, people running and screaming and bumping into each other and pushing each other. And it just relays just how much pandemonium there was going on. I mean, you have these fireworks going off and the loud music and the stage lights and people drinking, some of them probably really intoxicated. And then you got polyethylene foam melting, coming down, dripping down on people like black rain and with poisonous carbon monoxide and cyanide smoke. The temperature of the club got to over 1,400 degrees within 90 seconds. And with the poisonous smoke and people pushing, trying to get to freedom, to safety.
No, look, the reason that the way the building was constructed had 4 exits. And the way they think about exits, and this is something that everybody should keep in mind as they go to a place, is to see where the exits are, whether it's a restaurant, a movie theater, or even a club like this, is that the doors are rated based on their width. So the width of the door allows the inspector to say, or the fire marshal to say, well, this door is 3.5 feet wide. So therefore, mathematically, 150 people can get out this door in 1 minute. So there were 4 exits at the Station Club. So that means upwards of 600 people could have been in that building and gotten out in less than a minute. The problem is what you talked about with that fire. So where the fire started, because it was so fueled by this foam, it got to more than 1,000 degrees, up to 1,400 degrees in a matter of seconds. And that was right near one of the exits. It was near the stage door exit. So the band got out that way and a few people got that way. But then at that point, that door becomes impassable. Now, much has been made about the door itself because the door did not abide up to code. It was not up to code. It didn't swing in the right direction. But Brian Butler's video shows us the door was wide open. So that wasn't a factor in whether that was an escape, but the fire was. And so that was effectively blocked. 3 other exits. One is through the kitchen. And prior to the Dedarian brothers getting by in the nightclub business, the fire marshal had made the club remove the exit signs that showed that there was an exit through the kitchen because that apparently wasn't up to code. So now you're down. That's basically eliminated it for most people. Now, people who worked at the club, they went out that exit. They knew exactly where it was, and that's how they got out. And then that leaves you with 2. One goes out to the parking lot, and the other was the way people came in through the main entrance. So our lizard brain tells us in a panic situation, go back the way you came in. It's what's imprinted there. Now, you know that there's an exit there because that's how you came in. Right. Well, the problem was when you had hundreds of people all head to the same exit at the same time, this created a bottleneck. And in fact, most of the people who perished are right at that door. They're in the door jammed. They're piled up behind the door. They're right there. And a significant number of people who perished are near that exit, the kitchen door exit that they didn't know was there. And you have to wonder if those exit signs had been up, Would people have known to go out that way, and could that have saved some lives? So again, this gets into all the things that went wrong, and part of it is our human nature. When we panic, we retrace our steps because our brain knows that's how we got in, so that must be how we get out. But when hundreds of people do that simultaneously, we just said the door is rated for 150 people per minute to leave. No one had in mind that they'd be in a building that would go up in a matter of seconds because of this foam on the wall. In fact, when the fire started, people thought it was part of the show. When the pyrotechnics go off and the flames start creating these columns of flames up the side of the stage, we're 30 seconds in after the fire has started before people realize, oh, this is not part of the show. I got to get out of here.
This is the first song.
Yeah, I mean, we see it in the Brian Butler video. We see people are still partying. They're still dancing. They're still giving that, rock and roll sign, and they are loving it. And the band is still playing. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, this is real. So now we're down to 1 minute. 1 minute for hundreds of people to get out of that place. We just talked about how the band door exit is gone because that's where the fire is. The kitchen exit is unknown. And now you're down to 2. And most people head to the way they came in. And so it's just a tragedy what happens.
I had to put the book down one night when I was pretty early in the book. And this is not any fault of yours. I mean, this is wonderful writing and just very descriptive language. But the story of the concert goer who was trapped on the ground and like the bodies piled on top of him. And that person survived.
Yes.
Because there was just humanity on top of him, protecting that person from the melting black rain of the melting foam coming down on him. What a horrible tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy.
Well, that guy Mike Vargas, and I encourage people to read that chapter because it's amazing. Like, he was a high school wrestler, and he knew, as wrestlers would, and I would know this, that if the guy's pitting you with your chest to the floor, you're going to give up because you can't breathe. But if you turn on your side, the weight coming down on you doesn't make you choke off your air. So he turns on his side. He knew this. It was his instinct to turn on his side as somebody fell on him, and created a little air pocket for himself during this tragedy. Look, Phil Barr, the swimmer, part of how he gets out is he trains his whole from his teenagers on at breath control. This is a guy who can swim the length of the pool with just a couple of breaths in a highly competitive situation. So he knew how to hold his breath. He could hold his breath for a long time. I think that matters in these stories of people escaping.
From these tragedies through the trial and the aftermath of everything, and you're writing and you're researching. I mean, you're doing hundreds of interviews, thousands of hours, I assume, of interviews to put this book together. What was it like for you, Scott James, emotionally to submit this to a publisher, like when you were done?
Well, I think that early on, I had to decide how I was going to tell this story, because you're right, there's so much. I mean, think of this. There are 100 dead, hundreds injured. Every single person deserves to have their story told. They all have a story to tell. And the ripple effects went to thousands. So everyone deserves to be memorialized. Everyone deserves to be heard. But you can't do that and write a book. You have to make decisions. So what I did was I determined that I would tell the story through the eyes of a handful of people, really tell it. And these were not random people. I had to choose people who were there for the before, during, and after this tragedy, but also people who were there, kind of the people who were there in the room when significant things happened in this tragedy and its aftermath, so that we could be kind of the eyewitness to history and record things. Give examples, as we were just talking about Phil Barr, the swimmer. So he does survive, and at one point finds himself in a room where they're trying to raise money to help these poor people who have been left completely destitute. And in comes a deal with the devil. And the devil is the manager for the band Great White. Yes, the same band that started this fire that killed all these people. And he comes in and says, I know that you're destitute and I know you need money. And, Jack Russell, the man that you all hate, has agreed to do a concert series as a fundraiser for these people. And they have to decide, is it more important for them to take that money because these people are so desperate? Or do they say, we will never allow him to do anything for us because he's the one who caused all of this pain? So the people I choose are there, and they bear witness to these incredible human dramas that play out beyond, frankly, the one with the fire. So for me, getting to those moments and getting people to remember those moments in detail was difficult. So I think that instead of thinking that I did hundreds of interviews with hundreds of different people, it was really many interviews with those people who I selected to be the representatives, the few that represent the many. And that was a really interesting process. I would meet with somebody, we would talk about a particular scene, what might be a chapter or an event, and I'd interview them and get all the details, and I would go home and I would write it up as a chapter or a section, and then I would return months later, and we would sit down at the kitchen table and we would go over it line by line, word by word, because the scene was written from their point of view, from their lens. So if I'm going to claim that I know what Phil was thinking at that moment, I better make sure I've got it right. So there was a lot of back and forth, and that was really difficult for Phil and for other people to relive these moments. But by doing that process, by writing drafts, checking, rechecking, going back and forth, a whole other layer of details bubbled up in that process. I think the book, in some ways, reads like a novel in some sections, and it does because of this intimacy that I was able to obtain in connecting with the central characters. Now, I couldn't do that with every character in the book, but with the central characters, I think that was part of the process. So for me, those were difficult and emotional times. It's really hard to think of a time when an interview wasn't emotional. Even a fact checker. I remember going to this one guy who doesn't have a prominent role in the book, but I wanted to fact check because he was a witness to one of the main characters. And I go into this meeting, and he's a very confident young man, and he's like, "Sure, I'll help you with this. I haven't really thought about this in years." Well, 3 hours later, we're like a puddle, two puddles of emotion on the floor. And that was just doing a fact check of like 3 pages of draft. So it was emotional, and it was emotional for other people more than it was for me, because they are reliving something that was happened to them. There is no closure in something like this. We use that word gets passed around a lot, especially in legal cases where there's been a tragedy. And we think, well, I'm going to convict that killer and they're going to go to prison for the rest of their lives, and we're going to have closure. But the Attorney General, Patrick Lynch, talks about this in the book, and he is correct. There is no closure for something like this. At the end of the day, you come home from the funeral and or from the sentencing day, where the bad guy you think finally got what he deserved.
Right.
And the bedroom is still empty. There's still a tombstone that you visit. The loved one is not coming back. Many of the people involved in this case thought that there was never justice. And there were big reasons for them thinking that. Number one, the local law did not allow for any criminal accountability for the people who were hurt.
Has that changed?
No, that has not changed. So you have 100 people dead, but for the people who were injured, nothing was going to be done. I mean, to me, that is incredible, but there's no mechanism in the law. And frankly, other states even the outcome would have been even less. So Rhode Island had something that they could hold some people accountable, but some states have nothing. So for those people, and there are hundreds of them, plus their family members, there will never be any justice, because they didn't get even an indictment that said, recognized that they had been hurt, injured, that they had pain. So closure is not something that's going to happen for people who are intimately involved in this case. What I can do after all of these years is try to lay out a fuller set of facts than they were given before, because there was such limited information. People wouldn't talk. Many people wouldn't talk and share their story. Well, now they do. And so you can sit and judge for yourself as to what you think happened. And I think most people, when they read this book, are going to conclude this was not just a couple of dudes. There were bigger issues here. about our systems, about our institutions that we still need to consider today. We just went through a pandemic where we are questioning now at a massive scale whether our institutions have really done what we thought they were going to do to us in our hour of need. I think many Americans would be hard pressed to say that the system really worked. The system didn't really work for people, and people have been left hurt. Well, the Station Nightclub fire was kind of the canary in the coal mine in my mind about how that these institutions and systems are really not what they should be, or really not what we think they're going to be.
Yeah, very well put. That brings us to the like the last third of the book, where you really did a great job of putting together these inspirational stories of people, how they did not get closure, as you just stated, but how they decided to open up a door and kind of walk out into a new part of their lives. And I was really struck, like you talked about Phil Barr, the swimmer, everything that he overcame. You tell that in wonderful detail in the book. And also we spoke a little bit about Gina Russo, and Gina, who lost her fiance Fred in the fire. She was very instrumental in telling the story, her important story of being there and losing Fred, and going through the therapies, the surgeries, the hospitalization, the pain and the suffering, and then becoming a part of the community that wanted to put together this memorial for the Station Nightclub fire. Tell us a little bit about the memorial and how that came around and what that meant to the community.
Well, it took forever. That's a fascinating thing. So the site of the nightclub sat as a makeshift memorial for more than a decade. So after the site was cleared of the debris, people went in and they put up crosses and little displays and memorials to their lost loved ones. It was all very grassroots and really very touching, very emotional. And that existed for a long time while they decided, well, what type of permanent memorial can we have here? But there was a twist to that too, because remember, we said that the Darian brothers, the nightclub business owners, were renters. They didn't own this land. It wasn't theirs to give away and say, okay, something awful happened here, go and remember these people. It didn't belong to them. So they had to go to the actual person who owned the property and owned the land. And while people like Gina were trying to get this person, Mr. Villanova, to donate his land, you had that other faction. Remember, I talked about how that people were set against each other. It's the victims' families versus the survivors. Sure. And there was all this bitterness and anger. Well, there was a certain group of faction within the victims' families who wanted Mr. Villanova's head on a platter and just were publicly vilifying him. The man received threats. Also, so at one time you've got some group of people saying, we want to do a memorial. Can you donate this land? And another group of people threatening this guy. So it took Gina to step in ultimately and persuade this person that this could be done. And he did eventually donate the land, but it took an awful long time to get there. We're talking more than a decade. And then she was on a time schedule to get it done. And she went and to some of the top people in the state, like former Governor Don Cherry, who was the governor during the disaster, to help her. And they organized, and they ended up raising, I think, a couple $1 million, either in cash or in kind donations. You had contractors donating the asphalt for the parking lot, things like that. It was a real community effort, and they designed this incredible thing. And one of the thing if you get a chance to go to see it, that is really memorable, is they created what was called a story wall. So this looks like a chapel, it's a garden and a chapel. Very cleverly done, a lot of music themes involved with this, because this was a rock and roll club and these were rock and rollers. But this chapel on the back wall of it is a timeline of events, very, very clever, where they basically look at all the things that led up to this disaster and all the things that happened in the aftermath. Key things like they talk about, some of them are obvious, like when was the band Great White formed? When did the brothers, buy the nightclub business? But they also go back further. They go back to the Coconut Grove fire of the 1940s in Boston, where hundreds of people died in a nightclub fire, where, you know what, lessons should have been learned then, and they weren't. There's a direct line between Coconut Grove and the Station Nightclub fire. So I just thought it was really brilliant in the way that they put this together, and they kind of put together these facts that lead you up to the moment of the tragedy. And then they, because of the Brian Butler tape, they can actually say second by second what happens in the immediate aftermath, and then they go further. And the wall does include the ghost ship fire in Oakland. So they also, it's a commentary to say, oh, the lesson wasn't learned before, which is why this happened. And by the way, you still haven't learned the lesson. So it's a really clever, engaging, different type of memorial than perhaps you would see otherwise.
In the minutes that we have remaining, I just wanted to just compliment you again. It's an extraordinary book. I thought when I was cracking it open, I was going to read about, the fire and, true crime or like an historical account. And I got that. But again, it was written with such just a wonderful, humane touch, the way that you honor the victims and you tell the truth and you dispel rumors. You just kind of gave a voice to those that don't have a voice. And what a wonderful thing that was. So you have a great gift with your writing ability, and to, take the time to put all that together and to set the record straight in a lot of ways. It's just, it's an extraordinary piece of work. And I know it just came out a couple months ago, but how's the reaction in Rhode Island been to the book?
That's a really good question. I think that for people who lived this personally, I think, for example, somebody like Gina Russo would have a tough time getting through what we refer to as Act 1 of this story, which is the fire itself.
Sure.
And so there's that. I mean, but the larger reaction is kind of amazing. And every day on Facebook, I probably have at least a dozen people who comment or message me who are reading the book in Minnesota and in Iowa and in Washington State and in Tennessee, and they're from all over. And I especially like hearing from young people who maybe weren't around when this happened, or they weren't old enough to remember it, who say, I just can't believe this happened. I mean, it's a cautionary tale, and people are accepting it as such, and they're hearing it and they're remembering, and perhaps they'll take action as a result. And that would be the best outcome, I think, for me, is for people to look where those exits are when they go out. Just a self-preservation thing, but also to step up and say, is that really how our justice system operates? And can we be doing better than that? Is it really how things work? Is it really true that in this day and age, you can ask that there are buildings for rent that the public's going to go to that still don't have sprinklers? And can we do something about that? Can I go to my town council and saying, wait a minute, can we stop that? This is not, these are things that can be dealt with. So yeah, I get those type of reactions from all over the country every single day. And it kind of blows my mind that I don't know, we want to say, but it's a little creepy. You want to say, well, how did you find my book? How did you know to read it? Because I don't really know how things like that happen. It's not like, it's just, books are odd. They catch on by word of mouth. And as the writer, you want to sometimes deconstruct that and say, how did that get to you? Now, of course, it's being on programs like this, people hear about it, but also people tell other people about it. It really is fascinating how this goes. So in Rhode Island, though, more of an emotional reaction, as you can imagine. I did we can't do in-person events because of the pandemic. So traditionally, I would be doing in bookstores or something like that. But I did an event at a little tiny bookstore in Plainville, Massachusetts, which is right on the Rhode Island border, a virtual event. And so you do it by Zoom, and people can sign up ahead of time on Zoom, register if they want to ask questions. And I had like 48 people in the Zoom room who were asking questions. But they also simulcast it on Facebook Live. And there were 850 people watching live on Facebook Live while I had the 48 people in the room. And that also amazed me there's no way if you were just doing a regular bookstore event that you could have a total of 900 people at your event. No bookstore is big enough for that. So to me, that is one of the weird twists of this pandemic, is how different it is to launch a book in this time, and how does the word get around to people. But also local interest, small town Massachusetts, not too far from the Rhode Island border. Those people were intensely interested in hearing about this. People there generally think that justice wasn't served, and they generally think that they never got the full story. And so hopefully they'll feel like they got at least more of it with this. That was part of my goal, was to get the story in all one place where people could consider it all. But, that said, we're talking about tens of thousands of pages just of one secret grand jury testimony that I had to consider for this. And not all 10,000 of those pages are stuck inside the book. So you have to make choices about what you're going to include. And so there's a lot more. And I people who are amateur sleuths, there's plenty more to dive into, even beyond what I put out there.
Well, for people that are interested in their own local politics, I think it's a necessary read, just to see, like you said, how the system can fail people. People that are interested in the criminal justice system, musicians, I think should certainly read this book.
Yes.
If you're just a music fan, like you said, when you go to a place, it doesn't hurt to check out the layout of the club that you're at and see if how that can affect your evening. I remember playing shows immediately afterwards, and some people are like, "Hey, they were on stage and like, oh, the exits are over here and everything's there," and it was a lame attempt at humor, but at the same time, it was on everybody's mind. There's different clubs in Omaha that could have happened to that club, I'm guessing, in Omaha at the same time. And hopefully, like you said, there's some kind of legacy where, and even with this memorial, that there's a lot of work to be done with concepts of safety and just everything like that. So it's an extraordinary book. And for you, a multiple Emmy Award-winning journalist and writer, for you to, spend so much time with me and my listeners this evening, I am so appreciative that we had this opportunity to have this conversation. It's just a fantastic book, and I want to thank you very much for being a part of the program tonight.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate the fact that you read the book, and really excellent questions. I really appreciate that. My
pleasure. My best to you. And I know you also write fiction books as well.
I do. I've had 2 novels previously to this one. One was a thriller, and I actually think that and that was almost 10 years ago now, but had I not written that thriller, I think that prepared me for writing this story, because in some ways it really is like a page turner and a thriller, but in real life. And so, our journey as writers are complicated. Mm-hmm. I also do some newspaper writing, and that certainly prepared me for taking on a project like this. Been writing on and off for the New York Times since 2009. And as you can imagine, they have very exacting standards to write for that newspaper. And honestly, if I hadn't done the work at the Times, I don't know that I would have taken on this book. I felt it prepared me to do a serious investigation like this one.
Well, I've had just a wonderful time talking to you this evening. And everybody, if you want a very thorough, graphic, but wonderful read, please pick up a copy of Trial by Fire. It's wherever books are sold, and we will have links to it from the Necronomicast page. Wherever you listen to this, we'll have links available so you can just really take a look at this book by Scott. It is an incredible piece of work. Like I said, part history, part true crime, inspirational stories. It's just a fantastic read by a fantastic writer. And Scott, I thank you so much for your time this evening, and I'd love to have you on again sometime. And maybe you'll write a horror book or something like that, or something we can chat about. Maybe I'll pick up that thriller.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Necronomicast. Well, there we go. Emmy Award-winning journalist and author Scott James about the Station Nightclub fire. What a great book. Incredible. And I say these things not to kiss his rear end. He doesn't need me to do that. It's a great book. Fantastic. Scary as hell, but also very inspiring. Next up on the Necronomicast for episode number 196, it's my pleasure to bring to you the supernatural Seamus and the observer of the odd, an expert on the paranormal, occult phenomena, punk rock, everything weird. What you think is weird is weirder than you think when we have John E.L. Tenney on the program. An incredible conversation. I can't believe I had the opportunity to record it with him, but I did. And you will be able to hear it in just a couple weeks. That'll be episode number 196 of the Necronomicast. Johnny L. Tenney. Look out, kids. So this was episode 195. Copyright 2021. Thank you for listening, everybody. Now, go get some sleep.